I should probably start by telling you something straight, because whenever my name ends up in the middle of a political storm, people like to twist it into whatever shape makes the most noise. I'm Warren Buffett, and for most of my life, I've stayed on one side of the line. I talk about business, I talk about markets, and I talk about long-term thinking. I don't shout, I don't dramatize, and I certainly don't wake up in the morning looking for a fight with Donald Trump. But this time I watched something unfold that even I couldn't ignore, because it wasn't only a political story, it was a money story. And when political money gets loud enough, it always drags people like me into the conversation. Now, to be completely transparent, I didn't walk onto a stage, slam my fist down, and scream out the names of the billionaires funding Donald Trump's campaign. That's the sort of theater you see on cable news. Not in Omaha. What I did do was speak plainly about something I've warned about for years. When you turn economic policy into a weapon, the very people who bankroll your path to power end up taking the blowback. And once I said that, a lot of folks realized something they hadn't bothered to look at. The people financing Trump weren't doing it out of charity. They were doing it because they believed he could protect their business interests. And suddenly the headline everywhere was Buffett exposes Trump's donors. The truth is more complicated, and I'm going to tell you exactly why Trump got angry about it. Before I get into the details, let me tell you the moment I knew trouble was coming. It was a quiet morning in Omaha, the kind where the sun rises slowly and the phones on my desk stay silent just long enough to fool me into thinking I might get a peaceful day. Then my assistant walked in and said, "Mr. Buffett, your comments about the tariff question are everywhere. Reporters say it's causing panic in Trump world." Panic, that's a word I've never cared for. Panic is just ignorance moving quickly. But when it starts affecting people who run campaigns, raise money, and rely on wealthy patrons, well, then it turns political. What I had said very simply was that a trade war is a blunt instrument. It rewards a few temporarily, hurts many immediately, and eventually boomerangs back onto the very architects who think they can control it. That comment didn't mention Donald Trump by name, but everyone knew who I meant. I've criticized tariffs for decades, long before he entered politics. But the moment the words left my mouth, analysts and journalists began connecting the dots. They realized the biggest losers from the sudden tariff shocks were the very people pouring money into Trump's campaign. It wasn't a partisan attack. It was a mathematical observation. But math, when it embarrasses the wrong people, becomes a political grenade. And here's where things got interesting. I began receiving quiet messages. Nothing dramatic, nothing written down. Just people whispering that Trump was furious because my remarks put a spotlight on something he didn't want mentioned. The donors who had just watched billions in paper wealth vanish in a matter of hours after one of his policy announcements. These were not small dollar supporters sending $20 from their kitchen table. These were the titans of oil, gas, shipping, steel, and private equity. The people who wanted regulatory rollbacks, drilling expansions, and energy dominance. When markets dipped, their losses were immediate, public, and measurable. And my comments, though mild by my standards, reminded everyone that these losses were tied directly to the gamble they had made by hitching their fortunes to Trump's campaign. You see, the public often assumes billionaires just write checks and move on, but the reality is they monitor their investments, including political ones, the same way they monitor a major acquisition. And they were asking the same question any investor would ask. Why am I losing money when the person I'm supporting promised to make me richer? Some of them believed the turmoil would be temporary. Others were scared that backing Trump was becoming a riskier bet than they expected. But the moment I said publicly that trade conflict is a business landmine, it forced the whole world to look at the donor list and ask another question. Who exactly is paying for all of this chaos? Now, let me address something that has been taken out of context repeatedly. People claimed I exposed Donald Trump's donors. What I actually exposed was the economics behind their decisions. I talked about energy markets, currency strength, supply chains, and the cost of uncertainty. But because those issues directly affect oil magnates and real estate billionaires and high-risk financiers, the people writing the biggest checks, the press connected my economic warnings with their political contributions, and that apparently irritated Trump more than anything, not because I revealed a secret, those donor names are public record, but because my explanation made something painfully clear. Their financial losses weren't accidents, they were consequences. I've spent much of my life trying to understand how people respond to incentives. And the big donors behind Donald Trump responded to one of the oldest incentives in the world, profit. They saw deregulation, drilling rights, and tax structures that could save them billions. But they also underestimated something I've said for years. Markets hate unpredictability. And very often their worst losses come not from a tax hike or new regulation, but from sweeping unpredictable moves made in the name of political theater. When Trump announced another aggressive tariff shift, the market didn't wait for Congress or committees. It punished investors instantly, and those investors were his people. Still, here's the part most folks don't understand. Trump wasn't angry because I criticized his policies. That's something he's heard from me before. He was angry because I made it clear that the donors themselves were making the miscalculation. Calling a policy reckless is one thing. Suggesting the people financing your campaign are losing money because of you, that's an entirely different level of discomfort. It shakes the confidence of the very foundation you rely on. And the moment donors begin questioning whether their candidate is costing them more than he's protecting them, the cracks start spreading. I'll give you an image that sums it up. Imagine a card table in Las Vegas. A man sat down, confident, loud, bragging about how he always beats the house. His friends gather around throwing chips onto his pile, cheering him on because they believe he's going to double it. Then the dealer flips a card and the whole table gasps. Suddenly the friends have to face the truth. Their money is tied to someone playing a dangerous game. And when someone like me walks by and says, "The odds are stacked against you here," even if I don't mention the man's name, the whole group starts whispering. The man doesn't get angry at the dealer. He gets angry at me. Now, I've always believed that sunlight is the best disinfectant, but in politics, sunlight is also the most unwelcome visitor. When reporters realized my economic remarks lined up perfectly with the interests of Harold Hamm, Kelsey Warren, and a handful of other heavyweights funding Trump, they didn't need me to hand them a list. They went digging into FEC filings and discovered the picture for themselves. Their stories painted a portrait of a campaign financed by large energy donors who had just been slammed by the market downturn caused by Trump's own policy volatility. And suddenly it looked, as the headlines framed it, like I was the one revealing a secret. In reality, the secret had been hiding in plain sight. But I understand why the narrative stuck. People want a villain, a revelation, and a hero. And if the story is written correctly, the man calmly explaining basic economics in Omaha becomes the accidental whistleblower who triggered panic behind closed doors. It's a lot more dramatic than the truth, but drama is the currency politics trades in. And for Donald Trump, the worst part wasn't that I criticized his strategy. It was that my explanation forced the world to look at the scoreboard, and the scoreboard showed losses his donors couldn't ignore. Let me also clear up one last misconception. I'm not rooting against anyone. I'm rooting for stability, for sound economic thinking, for policies that don't rely on shock value to stay relevant. I've lived through nearly every form of political turbulence this country has produced, and the one thing I've learned is that noisy politics can sometimes hide a silent financial crisis. The donors backing Trump know this. They're not fools. But they were hoping the ride would be smoother, the rewards clearer, and the risks manageable. My comments didn't change their fate. They simply highlighted it. So if you want to know why Trump got angry, it's simple. I didn't expose a list. I exposed a pattern. And once a pattern becomes visible, the people inside it realize they're not playing a private game anymore. The world is watching the markets are reacting and the donors are calculating the cost, and nothing makes a politician angrier than the moment his financiers start wondering whether they backed the wrong horse. That's the truth, and we're only just beginning. If you stay with me this far, you already understand that I didn't set out to expose anyone. I simply described why volatility, especially the political kind, can be more expensive than any regulation, tax, or international agreement. But once those words left my mouth, the reaction became louder than I expected. Suddenly, people who had spent years operating in the shadows of political fundraising were being dragged into the open, not because I named them, but because my explanation forced journalists and analysts to follow the financial trail. And once they followed it, the truth sat there like an uninvited guest at a dinner party. A few days after my comment spread, someone close to one of Donald Trump's wealthiest supporters called my office. The man on the phone spoke softly, but I could hear the irritation pressing through every sentence. He explained that his employer, a billionaire energy tycoon, had just taken a massive hit in the markets after one of Trump's policy announcements. And the last thing they needed was for my remarks to magnify the narrative that backing Trump was hurting their business. I didn't say much in response. When someone is angry, the worst thing you can do is remind them that the numbers don't care. Markets don't move out of loyalty. Investors don't get special privileges because they supported the right candidate. Volatility punishes everyone in the same language. Losses, and those losses weren't abstract concepts. They were real, immediate, and painful. Some of the donors, particularly those in oil and gas, saw billions erased from their portfolios in just hours. A tariff announcement might sound like a patriotic show of strength on television, but behind the scenes, it's a bomb dropped on supply chains, currency flows, and global commodity prices. I didn't cause the explosion, I just explained the physics behind it. But explanations have a funny way of turning into accusations when people are looking for someone to blame. I heard later that Trump was furious because my remarks provided a narrative that cut far deeper than a political attack. Political attacks come and go. They're background noise in Washington. But telling the world that a candidate's own policies are costing his donors fortunes, that's a wound that bleeds into the financial world, the political world, and the media world all at once. It's the kind of wound that makes donors pick up their phones, call their strategists, and whisper about whether the risks are becoming too large to ignore. But I want you to understand something important. This wasn't just about donors losing money, it was about why they were losing money. During the last election cycle, Trump leaned heavily into the support of large-scale donors, many from the oil and energy industries, because the base of small-dollar supporters he once relied on began shrinking. Reporters have been tracking this trend for months, but my comments made people notice it with fresh eyes. And when the public realized that small donors were fading while large donors were taking financial hits, a bigger question emerged. Why were these billionaires still funding a campaign that seemed to punish their own balance sheets? You'd be surprised how many calls I received in the following weeks. Some from friends in business, others from strangers who simply wanted to hear the truth from my own voice. They all asked the same question. Warren, do you think these donors will pull out? I told them what I've always believed. Money doesn't have ideology, it has incentives. If the incentives disappear, so does the money. And the moment a donor realizes that their political investment is costing them more than it's helping them, they begin planning their exit. Now, that didn't mean the billionaire donors vanished overnight. People with that much influence don't just change course because the winds shift. They've survived for decades by betting on long-term returns. But doubt once planted tends to grow like a weed, and every time Trump made a dramatic policy move, those doubts got louder. A tariff threat here, a regulatory promise there. It was like watching a ship being steered by a man who navigates through storms by shouting at the waves. And while that might inspire a crowd, it doesn't inspire markets. One morning, I received a message from a veteran investor I've known since the 1970s. He's not a political donor, at least not in any meaningful way, but he watches markets with a discipline that puts most analysts to shame. He told me that the sudden swings triggered by Trump's announcements were starting to cause nervousness even among investors who had previously been unfazed by political turbulence. "This feels different," he said. "It feels like the people writing the checks aren't the ones controlling the story anymore." He was right. A campaign that relies heavily on a small circle of massive donors becomes a campaign shaped by expectations, and expectations, when unmet, turn into pressure. To be honest, the thing that surprised me most wasn't the donors' discomfort. It was how quickly the media transformed the situation into a narrative that I somehow had exposed the truth. One headline read, "Buffett puts Trump's donor network under the microscope." Another claimed I had revealed the financial backers behind Trump's troubled campaign. I hadn't revealed a thing. The donors' names were all public, their industries were obvious, their motivations were predictable, but the story needed a frame, and I became that frame. Meanwhile, inside Trump's orbit, there were reports of anger, not just at me, but at the very idea that anyone would question the loyalty of his donors. Loyalty is a precious word in politics, but loyalty built on financial interest is fragile, and when the value of the investment starts to fall, so does the allegiance that comes with it. Some insiders claimed that Trump believed my comments could scare donors into pulling back. Others said he feared it would feed the narrative that his campaign was unstable. I don't know which explanation is correct. But I know this: the more a politician depends on large donors, the more vulnerable he becomes to the perception that those donors might reconsider. I kept quiet for a while, not because I felt guilty, but because I understood the magnitude of the pressure building behind the scenes. Political campaigns operate on momentum, financial, logical, and emotional. The moment momentum cracks, everything becomes difficult. Fundraising slows, advisors grow tense, opponents sense opportunity, and the media smells weakness like sharks smell blood in the water. But weeks later, when a reporter asked me if I regretted my comments, I answered honestly, no. I've always believed that understanding the consequences of economic decisions is more important than protecting political narratives. If instability is harming investors, including the ones supporting a candidate, then the public deserves to know transparency is not an attack, it's accountability. Still, the story didn't end there. As markets shifted and new announcements came out of Trump's camp, donors began recalculating. Some doubled down, convinced the turbulence would pass. Others quietly reached out to alternative political groups, hedging their bets the same way they hedge portfolios. And Trump, according to people familiar with the situation, grew increasingly irritated every time my name resurfaced in connection to his donor network. It wasn't that I said too much. It was that I said something honest at a time when his campaign was struggling with optics. The truth is, campaigns don't collapse because of one bad headline or one bad week. They collapse when the people financing them feel uncertain, and uncertainty, especially when magnified by market losses, becomes the kind of pressure even the most confident candidate can feel. To understand the anger from Trump, you need to understand the psychology of political funding. A campaign wants donors who feel optimistic, protected, and aligned. A campaign does not want donors who feel exposed. And when the narrative formed that his biggest financial backers were losing money because of him, and that someone like me had highlighted the mechanics behind their losses, that narrative threatened the sense of strength he tried so hard to project. I didn't cause their losses. Policy did. Markets did. Reality did. But once people connected the dots, the picture became too sharp to ignore. And that brings us to the real turning point, the moment when the donor question became impossible for Trump to control, the moment when the conversation shifted from who supports him to how long will they keep supporting him. And in politics, no question is more dangerous. I've lived long enough to know that political storms don't hit all at once. They begin with a tremor, then a disturbance, and finally a shift so subtle that only people who've watched the horizon all their lives can feel it. That's what was happening with Donald Trump's donor network. What began as frustration behind closed doors was slowly spiraling into doubt. And doubt, when it reaches the people who fund campaigns, is more dangerous than any speech, scandal, or headline. To understand the final stretch of this story, You have to picture the environment around Trump during those weeks. He was pushing harder, speaking louder, framing himself as the only man who could fight the establishment. But even the loudest voice can't drown out silence. And silence was exactly what started creeping in from the donor class. These were individuals who were usually bold, confident, and aggressive about their investments. But suddenly, they were quieter, watching markets instead of rallies, asking advisors for risk assessments instead of photo ops. At some point, someone close to Trump must have told him the truth. The money wasn't drying up yet, but it was slowing. And slowing money is a louder warning than any critic could ever deliver. A campaign can survive scandals, media attacks, or even legal threats, but when the cash slows, that's the political equivalent of a heart murmur. It doesn't kill you right away, but it tells you something inside isn't working anymore. People think my involvement in all this was deliberate. Let me be clear. I didn't set out to weaken Trump's donor network. I didn't try to scare anyone. I spoke about the economics of uncertainty because it's what I've always done. But once the media connected my comments to the financial losses his donors suffered, the narrative grew legs of its own. Suddenly it wasn't that donors were losing money, it was that I'd explained why they were losing money. And explanations in politics often carry more weight than accusations. One evening I received a message from someone I had met many years ago, a man who now advises several high-level political donors, including some supporting Trump. He said, "Warren, you may not realize it, but your comments gave people a vocabulary for something they were afraid to admit. They didn't want to say the campaign was hurting them, but you gave them the framework to understand that it was." And I thought about that for a long time. People don't fear losses as much as they fear admitting they backed the wrong strategy. A billionaire can lose $1 billion and still sleep at night. But tell him he made a foolish bet that the person he trusted is the person costing him money, and suddenly the ego aches more than the balance sheet. And Trump, whether he admits it or not, understands that dynamic better than anyone. That's why my involvement frustrated him. Not because of what I said, he's been criticized by bigger names, but because of the effect it had on the people he depends on most. A turning point came when several analysts published reports linking the market downturn directly to Trump's policy announcements. Their charts and models told the same story I had been telling for years. Markets respond instantly to ambiguity. And ambiguity, unfortunately, had become one of his most consistent trademarks. When those reports went viral, donors realized they were sitting on top of a risk they couldn't control. A candidate who promises to fight the system can be appealing to voters, but to investors, a politician who destabilizes markets is the equivalent of a pilot who likes turning off the cockpit lights mid-flight to keep things interesting. I don't say that lightly. I've watched entire industries crumble because someone in power forgot the basic rule of long-term thinking. Uncertainty is the most expensive tax ever invented, and when Trump began doubling down on policies that rattled markets, it wasn't just stock tickers that took hits. Confidence did. Predictability did. The kind of stability that fuels long-term investment evaporated. And when that stability goes, donors start looking for lifeboats. Now, here's where things get personal. A political insider told a reporter that Trump was furious because it looked like I had undermined the story he was trying to sell, that he was backed by unwavering billionaires who believed he could reshape the economy for the better. But the truth is, money believes in results, not rhetoric. And when results start moving in the wrong direction, donors become pragmatic. They hedge, they wait, they whisper. Around that same time, I was asked during a financial interview if I thought the billionaire donor model was sustainable for Trump. I answered honestly, a campaign built on a small group of wealthy, high-risk benefactors is like a skyscraper built on a single pillar. It looks impressive from the outside, but the structure is dangerously reliant on the strength of that pillar. And if the weight becomes too much, the entire building can tilt. That comment didn't make Trump any happier. Behind the scenes, advisors began scheduling emergency conversations, reassuring donors, calling them fierce, and promising stability. But stability can't be promised, it must be demonstrated. And as long as markets kept reacting violently to Trump's policy declarations, the reassurance campaigns felt like bucket after bucket of water being tossed onto a forest fire. The moment things truly shifted came during a private gathering hosted by a prominent donor in Dallas, someone who had contributed millions to Trump's PACs. I wasn't there, but several attendees shared the same observation afterward. For the first time, donors weren't talking about how to help Trump win. They were talking about how to protect their portfolios if the chaos continued. When the conversation among donors pivots from supporting the candidate to surviving the candidate, the equation has fundamentally changed. I didn't celebrate that shift. I didn't encourage it. But I recognized it because I've watched that same shift play out in boardrooms, corporations, and markets for more than 70 years. Confidence is a currency all its own. And once trust cracks, no amount of shouting can patch it. Meanwhile, the narrative in the media kept growing. Buffett exposes Trump's donor problem. Buffett reveals the real financiers. Buffett cracks the donor curtain. Every headline exaggerated my role, but the effect was the same. The story became larger than any statement I made, and that's what angered Trump the most, losing control of the narrative. He wanted to position himself as the candidate of strength, support, and financial backing. But my analysis, however, introduced the one thing political movements fear most: doubt in the foundation, and when the foundation shakes, everything on top begins to wobble. Eventually, the calls stopped coming, not because donors were reassured, but because they were thinking privately instead of talking publicly. That's when the shift is real. Fear announces itself. Doubt stays quiet. Looking back, I don't regret anything I said. I've learned that telling the truth, especially about markets, is never the wrong decision. And the truth in this case was simple. The donors backing Donald Trump were not immune to the consequences of his policies. They were vulnerable. They were exposed. And whether they admitted it or not, they were beginning to question whether their investment would ever pay off. That is what the headlines called exposing the real donors behind his campaign losses. I didn't expose them. Reality did. Markets did. The consequences of unpredictability did. If Trump was angry, it wasn't because of me. It was because the money that once felt so secure was suddenly trembling. A political campaign can withstand many storms, but it cannot withstand the moment its financiers realize they may be the ones carrying the cost of the chaos. And that more than any speech, headline, or comment is the moment when a political empire begins to crack.